Recording. Okay. It'll be a fast lecture. That should make you unhappy. No smiles, these people. Okay, so we're carrying on from the hunger lecture because hunger is closely associated, people think, with having too many people in the world. And when I'm sure you have your regular conversations about global health with your friends, as I'm sure you do, because you're all so keen. People who don't know the field, the first thing they'll say, and I'm sure you've heard this, is the fundamental problem is there are too many people, right? Because too many people means not enough resources, not enough food, economic pressures, war, etc., etc., etc. So I will suggest to you that it's not that simple, that the problem of the world is not too many people necessarily. It might be a distribution issue. It might be something a little more interesting than that. So this, overpopulation. Hello. So what is overpopulation? The simplest definition is that if a place is overpopulated, saying there are too many people such that the carrying capacity of the land has been exceeded. And the carrying capacity is the ability of the land, of the environment, to sustain that population in terms of food, shelter, water, hygiene, etc. So why is it bad? Obviously, if we have too many people, we have diminished food supply, we have diminished water supply, and land overuse, something that often we forget about, because if you don't know agriculture, you don't know that we need to let the land rest every now and then to replenish the soil so that it continue to produce viable crops. So the food supply I mentioned, economic demand. So at a societal level, if we have too many people, maybe we have an inability for a society or a state to give appropriate services to those people. I would suggest to you that, again, it's not that simple because people also produce wealth. So what we're seeing in many parts of the world now is an underpopulation issue in some places and an overpopulation in others. If you haven't got sufficient people, you cannot maintain the economic growth needed to have the wealth that services those people. It's complicated. And from a health sciences perspective, because we always got to bring it back to that, right? Too many people means usually a dense population and possibly an easier spread of disease, right? We live in a weird time now where we have international travel that's instantaneous. You can contract infectious disease in Tokyo and have it in New York before the non-symptomatic period is over. So we have population confounded by mass travel, confounded by globalization, right? Now also with mass people, we have mass migration issues. So now every time there is any kind of disaster, whether it be a war disaster or a natural disaster, the next logical thing that happens is refugees. And because of population size increases, the size of the refugee populations are also increasing. So mass migration is an issue. And that leads to border insecurity. As we'll see in the climate change lecture, one of the biggest concerns about climate issues is the potential production of climate refugees. And climate refugees are an issue that the Pentagon, of all places, is taking a serious look at because it represents a potential security issue. Because amassing people at your border creates all kinds of stresses and insecurities. So when we're talking about overpopulation, we're not talking about sheer numbers of people, we're talking about density, the clustering of individuals. So this is a view of the world of where most people live in terms of density. Unsurprisingly, the densest areas are in South Asia and in East Asia and Indonesia. Indonesia is probably the densest portion of the world. Mongkok, Hong Kong is probably the second densest. And so forth. So if aliens were to visit the Earth, they're not supposed to land in Kansas where there's nobody. You think they'd go where there is most people. So none of those alien scenarios seem to work. They never land on the lawn of the White House. There's always some backwater swamp in Oklahoma. So if I were an alien, I'd target right there in Bangladesh. Okay. So when we're talking about population density, the easiest way to think about it is the number of people divided by the amount of land. Problem is that the denominator matters. If you use the entire surface area of the Earth, there are about 13 people per every square kilometers. On the other hand, most of the Earth is water. So if you use just the land area, you get 48 per square kilometer. Is it that simple? No, because much of the land you can't live on either. There's mountains, there's tundra, there's desert. So there are a variety of ways of thinking about population density. So there's something called the arithmetic density. That's the total number of people divided by the square of the land. There's physiological density. That's the population divided by arable land, because you can't live on tundra or grow food on tundra. Agricultural density, that's the rural population, and so forth. I won't go through all of them, but you get the idea. It matters the story you're trying to tell, which indicator and fraction you choose to express. So when you read about these things, make sure you ask yourself, is this the right number we should be talking about? Is this the right narrative that emerges from the story? This is data from 10 years ago, but it hasn't really changed all that much. The world population, it's about 7 billion. Soon to be 8 in a few years. The most populous countries are China and India. India will overtake China if it hasn't already, having to do with the nature of the age distribution of these countries. India is a young country. Most people are under 40. China is an old country. Most people are over 40, or over 30 at least. So China resembles us in that way, and so forth, right? So that's where the clustering takes place. These are the percentages. So about 40% of all people live in either China or India, and the rest are scattered about. The highest population density, on the other hand, is in these nations. Is there something about these nations that jumps out at you? Monaco, Macau, Hong Kong, Singapore, Gibraltar. What do they have in common? Yes. Some of the microstates, that's right. What else about them? When you want to live in Monaco in 1974, right? So what is about Monaco that appeals to you? Wealthy. They're all wealthy places. So maybe, on its face, there's something about population density and wealth. Now you could say that wealthy places attract people, or you can say that people create wealth. They're both kind of true. Microstates is a bit more complicated. Singapore, for example, they export a lot of their problems. So the working class live in Malaysia and they migrate in for the day, right? So they don't really deal with a lot of the downside of having people. So it's not that simple, but it starts the conversation or the thought that there's something about population and labor that's related to wealth. On the other hand, let's see where the poor countries are. Well, they're at the very bottom. So the least dense places in the world tend to be the least wealthy as well. So that confirms the suspicion that there's something about population size and wealth. So it ain't that simple. It ain't that simple of getting rid of people and make everything good. You have in your slide deck the answer to this question already. But when I talked to the general public about this, I showed them this graph. And I ask, what country do you think this is? So this is 1880 to 1945, the MMR, this obstetric death rate, this indicator of fuck-upedness of a population's health system was so horrible in this country, and then suddenly it got better in the 1940s. It would shock you to know that that is Great Britain, right? So because these data, this indicator state, that's like a Central African Republic. These are the descriptors of a very poor, dysfunctional sort of healthcare system. But of course, they got their shit together in many ways. And so today, many of the indicators of development for Great Britain are quite positive. And I bring this up because this was a recent development. And so we ask ourselves, these countries that today we would describe as problematic in terms of development indicators, why can't they, or are they, making strides towards achieving the same levels of development? What we're talking about here is something called the demographic transition. So this has been well studied in Europe. If you want to read more about the decline in mortality in Europe, you can read about it there. The demographic transition was a theory first put forth by a demographer named Thomson in 1929. And it is highly debated. I think there's a lot of evidence for it. And the question we have now is, it's a fact that certain countries transitioned 100 years ago. The question now is, are countries who didn't transition 100 years ago transitioning now? And by transition, I mean going from this fuck-up state to a less fucked up state, right? So in essence, the demographic transition says nations go from a high birth rate, high death rate state to a low birth rate, low death rate state. So which countries have low birth rates and low death rates? We do. The USA, not so much. Western Europe, Japan, possibly China. Right? Which countries have high birth rates and high death rates? Chad, Central African Republic, Burkina Faso, right? Countries that are still developing. So we're going from a pre-industrial to a post-industrial economy in many ways. The demographic transition exists in 4 stages, possibly 5. Have you learned about this in other classes? Good. So this will be a review. Fantastic. So the 4 stages are like this. The first stage is generally pre-industrial. So the economy is agricultural for the most part, unstable, very poor, reliable health care. So the birth rates are high, the death rates are high, but roughly in balance. And so population size is relatively low, or at very least not increasing rapidly. Right? The biggest confounder to the state of population is a natural disaster or an epidemic. So back then, in the pre-industrial state, in stage 1, the price of having a child is quite low. All you've got to do is feed it. Right? So you crank them out like nobody's business, because you never know. One of them might be a genius one day and get rich. Right? Or at the very least, they're useful as workers on the agricultural homestead, because most people are agricultural. So it makes sense to have children, especially since infant mortality is so high. Most of them are not going to survive anyway. So you tend to have a lot of children. It is inexpensive to do so, and they tend to be useful. Stage 2, the death rates start to drop. Why do they drop? Because we've invested in certain key things, easy things, like sanitation, clean water, vaccination. Okay? So the things that would have killed these children in early childhood, like infection, poor hygiene, or poor maternal care, are now controlled very, very easily. Building clean toilets, allowing for vaccination, understanding basic nutrition. Okay? So the death rates are dropping, but the birth rates are still high. So population is increasing. Stage 3, the birth rates start to fall now. And I want you to think about why that might happen. Why would the birth rates go down? We'll talk about that in a second. In stage 4, we have low birth rates and low death rates. Relatively even. Okay, so now we've come down again. So let's see what it looks like graphically. It looks like this. Stage 1, high birth rates, high death rates. Roughly equivalent. Stage 2, the death rates drop, but the birth rates are still kind of high. Stage 3, the birth rates start to come down. This, from 2 to 3, that's the transition, going from here to there. So people talk about the transition. They're talking about stage 2 to stage 3. Let's make sure I'm still recording here. Yes, I am. Okay, here's a real-life example. This is Sweden. And this is the real demographic transition of Sweden from 1735 to 1995, right? So these are the crude birth rate, crude death rate. Roughly equivalent, stage 1. Stage 2, the death rate starts to come down. Stage 3, the birth rate comes to join it. And today, actually, this is a stage 5 scenario, death rates exceeding birth rate. Now we think in Sweden, as in much of Europe, what happened here was the agricultural revolution that increased food production, in addition to advances in hygiene. So let's go through in greater detail. Stage 1, we have these things like drought and disaster and disease. These are things that are confounding our lives. But the population is still young, meaning the average age is young. Why is it young? Because we're squeezing out lots of kids. Right? And also people are dying young as well. So the average age tends to be very young. I mentioned the cost of a child is low. All you've got to do is feed them. The education system is poor, so you're not sending them off to private school. It's just food. But the value of a child is high because they contribute economically. Therefore, the child has a net positive economic value, and we tend to value them more in terms of producing them. So most of the deaths, though, are going to be concentrated amongst children. Stage 2, as mentioned, the death rate starts to go down. The survival of children increases, so the age distribution shifts even younger now. So in Europe, we think the agricultural revolution triggered a stage 2 process of population growth. Today, Yemen, Afghanistan, I have Palestine in quotation marks because that's politically problematic, but these are the countries that might be in stage 2, might be going to stage 3. Maybe parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right? AIDS has confounded everything. We're not sure how that's going to play out. Climate change is also confounding, so keep that in the back of your minds. What kind of improvements allowed us to enter stage 2? Well, crop rotation, selective breeding, of agricultural products. So we can improve our yield of food products. As I mentioned, vaccination, clean water, and so forth. Stage 3 is the transition stage. Birth rate comes down. Right, so I've asked you to think about why it might come down. And here's some reasons. If we're investing in female literacy, then women are less likely to have children. If we're investing in contraception practices, not just the technology, but also the values surrounding it, people have fewer children. There's also an economic component here, because in stage 3, suddenly societies are a bit more urbanized. So it's not worth your while to have kids, that many, if you are urban. If you're living in a condo in a city versus a farm in the countryside, kids are actually a net burden. Suddenly education's more expensive. What does a kid offer you now? Well, a child now costs you a lot of money in terms of educational demands, in terms of space demands, not just feeding it. In fact, food is actually quite inexpensive now. So now whereas before the cost of a child was quite low, now the net economic benefit of a child is high. So there's disincentives to have children. Urbanization is a big part of that. Right? You need fewer kids to maintain the family economic unit, because now you're not doing manual labor on a farm. You're probably running maybe a corner store, or maybe the kid's got a job that helps pay the bills. Right? So on the whole, stage 3 is about small families. So we think these countries have transitioned to stage 3 to some extent. India, Jamaica, Mexico, etc., etc., etc. Stage 4 is post-transition, because 3 was a transition. So pretty much every Western nation is post-transition. The USA is complicated, because the USA is actually a bit more heterogeneous than we think. We're a lot more Western-looking than the USA is. They skew to the younger side, and much of their population still, behaves family-wise as if they're in a developing world scenario. But countries like Canada, we have a fertility rate that's less than replacement rate. Replacement rate is how many kids you need to have such that you have no population growth, right? So if you're a heterosexual couple, you need 2 kids, 1 to replace the man, 1 to replace the woman. It's usually higher than 2. Why? Why on average is it higher than 2? It's usually 2.3, 2.2. Why isn't it exactly 2? Who's this 0.3 kids we're replacing? It's a running joke, because every time you talk about this in a pub with somebody, as I do, they always, well, you can't have 0.5 kids. Well, think about it. Obviously, yes.
Well, it's just because it's an average.
Right. So, but why is the average not 2 exactly?
Because people have, most people, it's like half the people usually have 2. And they have,
Okay, but we're not talking about the half. We're talking about the replacement rate. What is needed to have 0 population growth? Why isn't it exactly 2?
Is it because old people are currently dying faster than...
No. It's because many children die. Simple as that. You're kind of almost there, right? But we're not talking about a real scenario. This is a hypothetical scenario based upon the child mortality rate of that nation. So you need to have 0 population growth, not negative, not positive. You need to replace the mother, the father, and the kids that would have died. So if the child mortality rate is low, this number gets close to 2. But it's never 0. Child mortality rate's never 0. Even in Canada, it's down to like 5 per 100,000 live births. Right? So that's why it's never down there. As I mentioned, China resembles a Western European nation in terms of demographics. So they're approaching a demographic cliff where they may not have enough people to sustain their economy soon. So what is a stage 5, this theoretical stage 5? This is the deindustrialization stage, where suddenly your economy is not based on producing things anymore. It's based on information, as ours increasingly is. And the fertility rate is now below replacement rate. It's below that 2.5 or 2.3. Japan is the ultimate example. Greece, not so much anymore. Greece has kind of gone strange. So Japan is losing people, and if they continue on this trend, they'll be completely depopulated in 200 years. So the wealthier a nation becomes, the more economically advanced it becomes, the more likely it starts to enter stage 5, the higher the average age of that population. So that's where we are. In many of these countries now, we're entering this post-manufacturing state, and we have a dearth of people in advanced economies. All right. So this summarizes what I've talked about. Stage 1, equivalent birth rate and death rate, relatively high. Stage 2, death rate comes down. Notice population size, though, starts to increase here because more kids are being born, not dying. Stage 3, the transition stage. Birth rate comes down. Population growth starts to slow a bit. Stage 4, post-transition, population growth levels off. And stage 5, it comes down. So that begs the question, where is the world right now? That's the big debate. So many people will just see the throngs of people in Asia and assume, well, we're off on this explosive growth. But man, maybe we're plateauing. Okay. Before we talk about that some more, let's talk about a related concept called the epidemiologic transition. So in the epidemiologic transition that was first proposed by a guy named Omran, 71, he identifies 3 stages of human disease that are closely linked to the demographic transition. The first stage is the age of pestilence and famine, kind of like stage 1 of a demographic transition, when the things that would kill us would be the poxes, right? The smallpox and malaria and bubonic plague. And there are all these, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there are all these diseases in history that we don't know what they were. There's Henry VIII evacuated London during his reign because of the sweating sickness. Ever heard of this? The sweating sickness was killing off so many Englishmen at the time, and he was terrified of getting it. No one knows what it is to this day. We have some theories. So there's always episodes in history of these strange infectious epidemics. And there's a great epidemic in Austria, I think it was, where the entire town of, I think it was Vienna, was writhing on the ground for hours, hallucinating, seeing like UFOs and God knows what else, right? But back then, whatever the equivalent was. And no one knows what it is. It was probably some kind of fungal poisoning in the rice supply. But these epidemics of LSD trips, essentially. Right? And but the history is rife with this stuff. It's fantastic. I tried to create a fake science once called archaeoepidemiology, describing the history of the world through diseases. That's another story entirely. But it's a fascinating thing. Off on a tangent. But the age of pestilence and famine is when most of human history takes place. We are beset with the threat of infectious disease. The second is the age of receding pandemics. So that's really demographic transition 2 and 3. Mostly 2. Because with our hygiene investments, like clean water, vaccination, and so forth, suddenly the things that would easily have killed us, like a rusty nail, or someone sneezing in your food, that would have killed us a few hundred years ago. Now it doesn't. So these pandemics now recede. And lastly, the third stage that we're in now is the age of degenerative and man-made or person-made diseases. So give me some examples of degenerative and man-made diseases. Sorry? Cancer is one, absolutely. Another one. Yeah. Heart disease, sure. Give me a third one. Thank you. That's the big 3. Absolutely. Cancer, heart disease, and diabetes. Thank you so much. Okay. Now, an important nuance here is that those diseases didn't just manifest in this age. They were always there. It's just that they weren't the things that were killing us. The pestilence and famine was killing us. So now that the pestilence and famine isn't killing us anymore, these things are free to kill us. So in bygone eras, we didn't live long enough for the cancers and the diabetes to kill us. Now we do. We didn't have enough food for the heart disease and the diabetes to kill us. Now we do. So in many ways, that's good news. Doesn't sound like it is, but it kind of is, right? So do not think that the human animal has evolved biologically or physiologically to a state of suddenly we're all just born with heart disease. It's always been there. It's just that now these things don't kill us, so this gets to. And we may be returning to an age of pestilence and famine due to antimicrobial resistance. So don't be surprised if, if history turns back again. He laughs because I'll be long dead by then. This is your problem. Right. So the epidemiologic transition is simply the human phase of development that sees population growth mirrored with our kind of disease experiences. This is what it looks like graphically. So as the transition continues, infectious disease incidence, or things that kill, infectious disease that kill us comes down, and non-communicable diseases that kill us increase. The world is taking note. So there's a great call now to have non-communicable diseases being a priority for the WHO and other agencies. They're slow to act, but it will happen. But it'll probably happen just in time for antimicrobial resistance, and we'll go back to worrying about infectious disease again. Now, there's this thing called a demographic trap. Some countries, people are afraid, get to stage 2, but never get to stage 3. Remember, stage 2 is when we have solved the death problem. Kids aren't dying anymore, right? But we're still having lots of kids. Stage 3 is when kids aren't dying anymore, but we're having fewer kids. So demographic trap is you're stuck in stage 2, and you're stuck with these high birth rates and low death rates, so the population explodes. It's unclear if this is a real thing or not. And there's an element, I believe, of racism that comes into analyzing this kind of scenario. So, but in the event of a stage 2 scenario, you've got the country's economic growth, the new wealth, being used not to reinvest in certain things like women's education and societal development, but in creating even more children. Right? So building more nurseries or encouraging greater population growth. Some people point to Yemen as being a case of a demographic trap stage 2 scenario. Here's the population pyramid of Yemen. A population pyramid, if you've never seen one before, is this, right? It looks at the numbers of people at each age group divided by men and women. So here, at a glance, you can see that most Yemenis are incredibly young. This is the classic pyramid of an exploding, developing world country. Japan, by the way, looks like this. It's like almost inverted. Like they're so heavy on the old people. Canada is kind of like this, very narrow pyramid. So pyramids are a great way to quickly ascertain the demographic snapshot of a nation, probably whether it's going to transition or not. So it was in the 80s that they first coined the idea of a demographic trap, and a lot of fear around countries that we think are so trapped that they will suffer from food depletion, probably epidemics, and more likely border insecurity. One of the things that people always point to when they are afraid of a demographic trap is religion. They believe that certain social forces like deeply held religious belief trump, using that word now, but trump development initiatives. What I mean is, yes, the economics and the technology and the lifestyle may tell us, well, it's time to have fewer kids now. But if your belief system tells you, no, you need to have more kids because that's God's will, well, that's one of the social conventions that seems to conflate or confound this scenario. So I don't know what to tell you, but those are the criticisms. Here's an example of India thought to be in a demographic trap. You can read about that if you like. Well, in the hunger lecture, we talked about food security. And I think I mentioned Amartya Sen there. Amartya Sen is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he was the first one to suggest that accessibility is probably the most important part of food security. Therefore, the demographic trap is actually an issue of accessibility as well. Because when we're talking about demographic trap, what we're mostly talking about is a path to famine. If the population explosion is out of control, then there won't be enough food eventually to sustain this population. But he argues that no, famines are the result of lack of access, not the result of lack of actual food. Therefore, these are political issues, not scientific issues. And we shouldn't be too worried about this. Okay. So let's talk about criticisms of the demographic transition, because there are many. The first is that this model is based on observations of Europe, for the most part. And therefore, it may not be applicable to the current developing world countries. It does not account for these enormous, huge developments. I mentioned the AIDS epidemic, so that really confounds our ability to make predictions about population sizes. Epidemics are a big part of that. Climate change is another one. And some people complain that the model is overly optimistic, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. Other complaints. So this individual, this economist from Peru, De Soto, he argues that political barriers prevent transition as well. And globalization gives us one such political barrier. So consider this. When Europe transitioned, they were individual nations managing their own economies. There was trade, of course, but they were able to use their technologies and their interventions appropriately to transition from simply making a lot of food to manufacturing things and then to go into an information-based economy. Today, though, with a globalized economic state, there's a lot of political pressure to maintain the means of your production. So, if the world relies on you to create quinoa for hipsters in Brooklyn, then it's difficult for you to transition from a quinoa-producing economy to a high-tech finance economy. There's a lot of disincentives for it. The world will punish you for it. The world needs poor people to remain poor, the argument goes. So these additional globalization forces slow the ability of nations to take economic ownership of their own development. I mentioned that there's not enough consideration of social changes, like religion, right, or values of nations that are very strict around the roles of women. But going back to the political portion of it, so De Soto argues that in cases of Peru, for example, where farmers are not permitted to own their own land, it's owned by corporate concerns or government concerns, there isn't a lot of individual incentive, again, to transition from an agrarian lifestyle to an urban lifestyle. Again, these are all theories. It's unclear what's actually happening. These are the criticisms. You can't talk about population growth without talking about Malthus. And hopefully you've all heard of Malthus in the past. If you haven't, you should, because one of the great problematic thinkers of human history. So Malthus was an economist, and he wrote an essay called The Principle of Population in the 18th century. And he argued essentially that food production increases arithmetically. That means it's a straight line. The more land I farm, the more food I produce. So if I double the land, I double the food. I double the land, so it goes up in a straight line. Fantastic. Okay? But population accelerates in a geometric prediction, which exponential growth. So food, population. Therefore, he concludes that populations must always outgrow their food supply. Okay. An example that David Suzuki always makes is imagine our world is actually a test tube full of bacteria with a doubling time of 1 year. So in the test tube, you start off with this much bacteria. 1 year later, you get this much. A year later, you're half full. So a year after that, the test tube is full, right? But imagine that just before it's half full, all the scientists in the bacterial world got together. And by some miracle of bacterial science, they create an entirely empty additional test tube. Whew, our problem is solved, except 1 year after that, that's full as well, because the doubling time works like that. So that's essentially the Malthusian argument, that the nature of population growth being exponential means that we will always outgrow our resources. That's called the Malthusian collapse. Societies must always collapse due to population growth. And when you talk about this with the non-specialists on the street, they'll always point to something like this, because it's logical thinking. Population growth means not enough resources. So essentially it's saying that population growth is ahead of agricultural growth. Therefore, there must be a stage at which there's insufficient food or resources. Fantastic. And this is the graph I was talking about. Food produced, population growth. So this is the trap. The trap takes place here. Fine. So what's wrong with that reasoning? Well, it didn't happen. He predicted it would happen to the world sometime in the early 1900s. It didn't happen. Hasn't happened yet. So what's going on? Well, here's one criticism. This is William Godwin. He's not an economist, but a philosopher. And he says, you know what? There's plenty of land out there. And reproductive rates are not geometric. They actually fluctuate a lot. Okay? We're not doubling every year here. Canada, we're actually going down in population. So population growth is not geometric. Malthus is full of shit. That's what he says. Marx, you know Marx, right? The founder of Marxism. Marx will go down in history not necessarily for his role in creating Marxist societies, but for the innovation in economic thinking that labor is capital. Prior to Marx, labor was a detriment, a cost. We have to hire people to work. He says, no, labor is actually an asset. The more people you have, the more productivity you have, the more wealth you have. So rising population is actually a measurement of wealth. So This led to something we call the unified growth theory, which suggests that human economic development transcends this Malthusian trap. And this was a popular way of thinking in the mid-20th century. Yeah, it may or may not be true, but it suggests something I said earlier, which is that these highly dense populations are wealthy for a reason, because people create wealth. Some people talk about the Great Divergence. This is a historical term that really refers to how Europe became wealthy in the 20th century. And they think the Great Divergence happened shortly after the Industrial Revolution, before World War II, when suddenly when Europe and the developing world were kind of on par in terms of wealth and power, but Europe just took off and became incredibly wealthy. Due, we think, to economic investments. Colonialism was a big part of it, but also maybe the transition. So, in general, if you support Malthus, you believe that the land has a limited ability to sustain population growth. And if you don't support Malthus, you believe that other factors will intervene. What other factors? The free market, perhaps, right? Or this thing that we call the demographic transition. So, earlier this year, I wrote an article for the Huffington Post where I outlined for the lay public how the demographic transition works. And I pointed out that many of the demographers today think that we are going to plateau in population growth at around 2070, the year 2070, somewhere between 9 and 12 billion people. It's a lot of people, but then it'll come down after that. Most of the models suggest it will come down at the end of this century. So we're approaching a peak, and it's going to plateau and come down. I got so much hate mail. It's amazing how much hate mail I got. And it came in a variety of flavors. But the underlying tone, as I always point out, is that when we say that people are having too many kids, what people aren't saying, what they're thinking is, those people are having too many kids. It's never these people. It's always those people. There's a racist element to this. I have a grad student who's doing her thesis on population growth and environmentalism, and how the need to reduce an environmental footprint should be an argument for population control around the world. Population control is a laden, politically heavy topic. There are instances in history when people have been forced to sterilize. In India in the 70s, during what's called the emergency, this is a period of martial law in India, the government took it upon themselves to make it mandatory for men to be sterilized if they wanted government jobs as a way to control population. So population control is a dirty word. The thing that's missed from that analysis is, Asia is increasing its population. The biggest growth area in the world, believe it or not, is sub-Saharan Africa. So by the end of the century, that will be the place that's growing the fastest. But here's the thing. Despite the fact that sub-Saharan Africa and Asia has the most people and they're growing the fastest, their ecological footprint is minuscule compared to ours. Their per capita footprint. So they could add 100 million people and it won't be as damaging as 100 Westerners. Right? So there's this racist element of this analysis that never enters into the larger dialectic. And you have to consider that all the time. And I certainly felt it with the hate mail I got, because I'm an apologist for the Muslim horde, apparently. It's hilarious. So then Al Jazeera interviewed me, which is hilarious too, because I thought it was going to be a print interview. So we Skyped a bit and we talked about stuff. I didn't realize they were recording me, and that became, you can look at the interview in here. They explain the demographic transition really well on their video. It's been viewed 35 million times. Had I known that, I would have showered. But again, more hate mail for that. That was great. So the point of those stories is that if we are transitioning, and I think we are, I think the world is actually heading for population decline at the end of the century, unless there is some other great confounder like antimicrobial resistance issues or climate change issues. Then we need to accept that this will change a political dynamic quite profoundly. So, because places like Europe and Japan don't have enough people to sustain their economies. And the only way to maintain their economic wealth is through immigration. So a lot of the tensions we're seeing, the ethnic tensions we're seeing around the world, have to do with one group not having enough people and the other group providing those people, but also providing cultural conflict at the same time. If you're curious about the political nature of this, there's a horrible, offensive documentary on YouTube called Demographic Winter. It's a white supremacist documentary, but it's hidden. It's described, it's disguised as demography. It's called Demographic Winter or something or other, but it's really white nationalists complaining that the dark hordes are outbreeding them. But they bring in a lot of these arguments to justify essentially a race war. So this is complicated, dangerous stuff. But let's say we actually do want to control population growth. Consider the hypothetical nation of Dionandia at the center of the world with this charismatic, brilliant king. And we have 100 men, 100 women in perfect reproductive health. In their early 20s, really horny, no contraception, no values or Catholic restrictions on behavior. So, and no monogamy or any of that stuff. So 9 months later, after all this heterosexual coupling, how many babies do we get? You get 100, right? 100 women squeeze out 100 babies. Fantastic, right? Now, let's say one of the men falls off a cliff, right? But they continue on in their orgiastic rituals and activities. 9 months later, how many babies do we get? 100, because these women still squeeze out one baby each. See? Another man falls off a cliff. 9 months later, how many babies? 100 babies. One lucky man is left because they all fell off a cliff after binge drinking. Okay? He has a really good time for 9 months. How many babies? 100 half-sibling babies emerge. All right. Now consider the opposite. Let's say we have 100 men and 99 women. One of them falls off a cliff. 9 months later, 99 babies. Another one falls off a cliff. 9 months later, 98 babies. One very popular, busy woman is left with 100, eager men. It's The Bachelor in reverse. I don't know. 9 months later, you get one baby. Obviously, you see the point. The point here, of course, is that population growth is unfortunately gated by female fertility. Okay? And this correlates so much with problematic politics, where societies attempt to control female fertility, because they understand that's where the control is most easily affected. So to address population fertility, we address female fertility problematically. The problem with that analysis, of course, is that not everybody has 100% fertility, contraception, all these caveats, sure. But that idealized example was made to really sell the point. So as a result, we take female reproductive rights very seriously in international health and development because it's simple, it's easy, it's tempting for governments and societies to slide into a zone of controlling female fertility. So female reproductive rights include things like the right to reproduce or the right to not reproduce. And we tend to include abortion among those rights, to not reproduce. You have a right to education about your reproductive health. That includes access to contraception and understanding risk. And you have a right to be free from reproductive alteration. And that means things like forced sterilization and mutilation. Now, these apply to men as well, obviously, okay? But they're more critical for women. As a result, we have the MDGs that focused quite explicitly on aspects of female reproductive rights. So MDG 3 and 5 looked at gender equality, and 5 was improving maternal health. Now, the SDGs have combined these now into larger, more complicated and comprehensive frameworks. But why is female education so important? Well, because if we reduce if we educate women, they tend to have fewer kids, and we kind of want them to have fewer kids to sort of hasten that transition process. If women are educated, we lower infant and child mortality rates because women are the primary caregivers still for most kids in the world. We think we lower HIV infection as well, because in fact, studies do suggest that girls' education is a strong predictor of whether or not society will have low HIV rates. And we lower maternal mortality rates because then women can make more educated choices about their own care when they're pregnant. Simple stuff. Here's a good stat. 1 year of schooling for 1,000 women prevents 2 maternal deaths per year. That is all, my friends. By the way, tonight, if you're interested, there is the Munk debates are happening. You know what the Munk debates are? Young scholars around the world should know about the Munk debates. So the University of Toronto hosts a debate every few months, paid for by Peter Munk, a very wealthy man, and they invite among the smartest, sometimes the evilest people in the world to debate. So tonight's debate is on whether or not the Trump White House is a force for democracy, or something like that, something Trump-based. And it's streamed live at 8 p.m., I believe. Monkdebates.org. I'll be live tweeting it. Watch it. It's good for you. That is all. See you on Tuesday.